Oh, really? That's so funny. You're just discovering this. Wow. See, you're like a hybrid media scholar.
You need to tell me when to start. Yeah, but they need to give me a go for the live streaming, I guess. Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session. It's my pleasure to give a little introduction about what we are going to discuss here today. So this is the facing the challenges of a datafied society, how journalists, activists, and hackers can make sense of datafication. And we are four academics, and we're going to go through some of the recent research that we have been conducting in this field at the border between journalism, activism, and technology. Since we are coming from the academia, we have a thing for abstract. So I want to go through what we put together here just to give you some context of what is the subject of this conversation. So we're going to go through how journalists and other hybrid players are now helping the understanding of the datafied society and the role of data in many democratic processes, including information, participation, and other things like this. And we are all interested into how journalism is changing from the perspective of hybridization. So in which terms and which ways journalism is adopting new things, is kind of absorbing elements coming from outside its own field. So new players, new tools, new strategies, and new standards for doing information and news work. And in particular here, we're going to discuss how these processes are also happening in the way we make sense of what is going on with and within the datafied society. And most of the debates about data became really mainstream because of the Snowden revelations. And it feels like yesterday, but the Snowden case exploded in the June of 2013. So it's almost 7 years ago. And again, it really feels like this morning, but a lot of time has already passed since we came to know the role of digital surveillance, internet surveillance, as came to play in contemporary society. So everything we can say really intensified following Snowden's whistleblowing. And a few years later, in 2018, we had also the Cambridge Analytica case that shed light on how the data economy and surveillance capitalism and the way the data are exploited online is really out of control. And of course, the Cambridge Analytica was a massively complicated case because it was involving data, it was involving the platforms, it was involving Mr. Trump and all that. But it really was one of those momentum where we actually came to face some of the troubles of the datafied society. And academic research about these things is doing its own work, and there are now many scholars, including us, who are really trying to dig deeper in what is going on. And these three quite recent books are some of the points of reference where we are kind of moving around with our work. So digital citizenship in a datafied society by a group of researchers based in the University of Cardiff, and of course Shoshana Zuboff's new book about surveillance capitalism. And when it comes to media studies more closely, definitely the hybrids media system by Andrew Chadwick is one of the milestones of the field. So I'm going to now stop presenting the context of this by presenting these ladies and gentlemen that I'm sharing the panel here today. We have Stefano Milan, who is an associate professor at the University of Amsterdam and has been doing research for years about technology and participation, cybersecurity, internet governance, and data journalism in particular. Then we have the gentleman over there, Colin Polezza, is a senior lecturer at the Department of Journalism at City University of London. He's Swiss and has been working also at my university in Lugano, Università della Svizzera Italiana, and in Zurich, and he's one of the leading researchers about data, journalism, and media transparency. We also have Adrienne Russell sitting here on my left. She's a Mary Laird Wood professor at the University of Washington, and she's, among other things, the author of Journalism as Activism, Recording Media Power, which is one of the other books that really pushed research forward in this field. And myself, I am Philippe Di Salvo. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Università della Svizzera Italiana, University of the Italian-speaking part of Switzerland, which I can tell you is a thing, based in Lugano. I do research about the interplay between journalism and hacking and cybersecurity in particular, and I'm also a journalist for Wired here in Italy. So we have a round of first insights here, and the first one speaking will be Colin about the reflexivity between the datafied society and the datafication of news, and how journalism is central in making sense of datafication's problem. So, Colin, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Philip. So my first intervention is kind of a kick-off to the whole panel, because what I would like to present is more of a theoretical framework, as Philip already announced, trying to explain how the datafication of society and the datafication of journalism at large happens basically in parallel. And this is not only, there's not only some reflexivity in there, but also some circular processes going on. And I will present 4 different areas where I think the reflexivity between the datafication in society and journalism can be particularly well observed. And my co-panelists will then also deepen some of these points. So the datafication of society, from my point of view, is characterized by data abundance and a platform capitalism grounded on the use of big data, the reliance on data as a means for surveillance or a blind belief in the facticity of data. And obviously also the increasingly dominant position of algorithms and artificial intelligence that influence an increasing part of each and everyone's life. However, these 3 accounts of datafication have a massive impact on the public sphere as well. This becomes especially clear in social media if they are used as a news source. So the public is increasingly confronted with opaque algorithms and automated selection processes, but the user has no insight in or understanding of the underlying decision-making processes. But at the same time, it causes hate, lies, and manipulation campaigns to spread incredibly quickly. The trend of datafication overall has been embraced, albeit with some resistance within the journalistic field as well. A range of new actors, such as entrepreneurial journalism, digital startups, but also sometimes actors at the periphery of journalism, such as WikiLeaks, for instance, created new forms of data-driven journalism, and especially a new breed of highly specialized journalists who also opened up to new forms of cooperation with actors from other fields, as we will also see today. The increase of structured and machine-readable data across society led to yet another transformation: the use of specific forms of computational and automated data analysis through algorithms. As a result, these new and at the same time alternative approaches to journalism rely on the same instruments and means that distinguish the datafied society itself, that is, data and algorithms. In other words, it facilitates reflexivity between the instruments that characterize a datafied society and their implementation in journalism in order to observe exactly these instruments of datafication. Journalism plays a central role in shaping the narratives around datafication and AI. This is even more important as journalism does not operate in a vacuum, but within a constantly changing social and technological environment it is forced to adapt to. Grounded on these reflections, I propose a framework to critically analyze the reciprocal relationship between journalism and the datafied society by deconstructing the notion of data-driven journalism into 4 specific functions of news work. First of all, the observation of datafication-related issues such as dataism. Secondly, the investigation of data surveillance. Thirdly, the generation of new data networks by journalists. And last but not least, unblackboxing algorithms in order to foster algorithmic accountability. So first of all, we need journalists to observe datafication-related issues. Now that data can be collected in areas previously inaccessible to structured scrutiny, the promised lands of behavioral knowledge and factfulness seem ready to conquer. Data have become a currency in exchange for apparently free-of-charge services. However, the trust in the explanatory power of data and quantification rests on a false assumption that data are facts in itself. This is nothing else than dataism, the blind faith in big data as an apparently objective and emotion-free solution to the many problems of mankind. These forms of dataism need critical scrutiny, particularly as there have been many examples of false starts in data analysis and algorithms in many different areas of society, such as, for instance, the legal system, where algorithmic output was clearly biased due to human biases programmed into the algorithms. Secondly, all of us remember when back in 2013, The Guardian and its editor-in-chief, then editor-in-chief Alan Rusbridger, were threatened with legal action by the government of the United Kingdom for the possession of secret British and American surveillance data revealed by the whistleblower Edward Snowden. The phenomenon of mass surveillance has triggered a sharp reaction by some news organizations. However, journalists' reactions to mass surveillance are not uniform and differ across countries as they are shaped by, and I quote here Heikkila and Cornelius, national settings and domestic struggles of power and legitimacy. Additionally, many journalists have been intimidated by governmental action, but the emergence of mass surveillance required journalists also to adapt to the new circumstances and to improve their knowledge and skills in relation to surveillance and how to protect themselves from snooping government agencies. And this is a wonderful example of this reflexivity. The third point I would like to raise is the generation of data networks by journalists. In countries with some restrictions in Freedom of Information Acts, for instance, in Italy, data journalists often collaborate informally with specialists such as hackers, programmers, and scholars, creating and fostering data networks that involve collaboration, collaborative action to collect and scrutinize public data. Such networks like Hacks and Hackers bring together experts from different backgrounds in order to facilitate skill exchange and to confront journalists with different cultural backgrounds and norms that have their roots in many different subcultures, such as the open source movement. The more journalists are using data, and the closer they work together with actors from other technology and data-affine areas, they progressively move from observation into analysis and denunciation, raising awareness and recommendations. This is the case of, as Stefania Milan would say, the case of advocacy data journalism. So journalism could thus become a powerful actor in today's data-rich public sphere and act as a facilitator for data literacy by sharing its experience in accessing, analyzing, and interpreting data. And as we will hear afterwards, this could also lead to a data journalist in a more activist understanding. Last but not least, also with regard to the power of algorithms in society, two different levels of reflexivity can actually be observed. First, the increasing expertise of journalists with algorithms, also due to the implementation of algorithms within their own newsrooms, allow reporters to engage in algorithmic accountability reporting, looking closely at what is going on in society and in relation to the algorithms. This journalistic genre could be further empowered by taking advantage of the computer experts and hackers present in these mentioned data networks. Some of the issues related to the opacity of algorithms are present within newsrooms as well. Making the data journalism production more transparent could help reducing skepticism and allowing readers to better understand and interpret the data. In this sense, transparency would also allow data journalists to show that they have carried out their job to the best of their knowledge, which in turn reinforces the notion of media accountability and transparency. To conclude, journalism is the central means to critically observe datafication, also because journalism can serve as a breeding ground for and mobilize new forms of civic engagement, political action, and data activism. By collaborating with specialized groups and networks, especially, or for instance, Hacks and Hackers, Spaghetti Open Data, and so on, journalism can boost its impact when it comes to pointing out relevant issues with regard to datafication in society. Inform citizens about the risks, opportunities, and their rights in cyberspace becomes therefore a central tenet for journalism. But journalists, and this is also a crucial point when it comes to reflexivity, have to live up to these standards by gaining the right skills and the necessary knowledge and data literacy in order to be able to point out dysfunctional developments of datafication in society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Colin. And since you already quoted her twice, I think it's time for Stefania to present her part of this panel about the borders between activism and journalism and how this is constantly shifting.
Yeah, thank you very much to Philip for putting this together, bringing us here. It's my first time. Oh, sorry. It's my first time in Perugia. It's very exciting, especially as a journalist in recovery. I still have my press card. And to Colin, who has provided an excellent introduction for what I want to say. So I'm going to take you to the land of activism more explicitly, and with the help of some quotes that me and my team in Amsterdam have gathered throughout the years. So as both of my co-panelists already made clear, datafication represents a fundamental paradigm change. And it is a paradigm change that, if you look at it from the perspective of the citizens, is altering the relation between the citizens and the state, or institutions in general, meaning the state as well as companies. And the Snowden case, but also Cambridge Analytica, the Facebook data breaches, are going exactly in that direction. We can say that all of this is sort of breaking the social contract between citizens and institutions. But also, datafication is a paradigm change because it has changed dramatically the nature and the role of information. So what has changed really is how evidence is produced. Where do you find evidence? The amount of evidence that you can produce to support a demand, for example, if you're an activist or your advocacy campaign, has dramatically changed. This means that activism is changing as well. So in a way, what I do in my daily job is to look at how people enact their political agency in their daily practices of participation. So how can we be effective citizens of our digitized polis today, for example, but also how can non-governmental organizations, hacker groups, and you name them, make a difference in the world they live in. So big data, just for the sake of brevity and everything that goes around big data, we have heard already something about artificial intelligence, the automated production of information, is really a new terrain of engagement for citizens, which results in new bottom-up data practices. So in Amsterdam, we are a group of people. It's not just me. We are about 10. We are called Data Active. That's the name of the project. And we look at what we call data activism. What is data activism? It was already mentioned, so I just define it briefly. Data activism is a specific type of activism that emerges at the intersection of other fields, other subcultures like the open data culture, the open software culture, the hacker culture, but also the civic media / community alternative media scene, and that tries to take a critical stance towards datafication and massive data collection. So what we look at is definitely also the interaction between journalists and activism. We look, for example, in open data and transparency campaigns, but we also look at anti-surveillance activists, those that, for example, as it's going to be mentioned later on, develop encryption tools, use encryption tools, engage in obfuscation tactics to subvert, in a way or another, the massive data collection that affects everyone as part of the society we live in. So from this privileged point of view of data activism, how is activism changing if data becomes the new currency of activism? And I want to touch upon 3 main points. There's much more that can be said, but I'm going to focus on these 3 big shifts that have to do really specifically with the intersection of journalism and activism. And they are hybrid repertoire. Second is new alliances, but also, new alliances were already mentioned by Colin, but also new divides in the fields of society. And finally, the hybridization of roles. And I'm going to use quotes from activists and the many interviews. We've done over 200 interviews across the world in many countries, and they've been done by myself, my team, but also Miren Gutierrez, who works at the Universidad de Deusto in Spain. And all of this is, by the way, some nice pieces of writing. If you're curious, I can point you to. So first point then, hybrid repertoire. Gathering evidence has taken central stage in activism today. I mean, this is not new. We might call it data, big data, but information has always been at the core of campaigning. And it's always been at the core of any advocacy effort where people try to go and tell their governments, for example, or a specific company that some practice needs to be changed or some injustice corrected. So we have changed the language around it, but definitely we have also changed the scale of the information, the type of information that can be produced. And in that sense, we see activists that appropriate increasingly the repertoire of journalism. So advocacy and campaigning blends with investigative journalism. And for example, there's a group that does that very well. They are here as well, the Syrian Archive, that has already been mentioned, that does activism to document the violences in the Syrian conflict by using the mindset, if you want, of investigative journalists. People will try to look for stories in large amounts of information. But to be sure, the movement also happens in the other direction. So we see more and more journalists that feel compelled to get into activism, to move into activism by the situation that they observed. We, for example, interviewed a number of journalists that were active around the Panama Papers. And what they told us is that, and I quote, well, we discovered through engaging with this large network of people, looking at this enormous amount of information that we would not have been able to process in a newsroom alone, that journalism is actually not the aseptic profession that I was taught in a North American university, but in fact is a much muddier profession that really calls into question also values, for example, which is something that I can tell you, being trained as a journalist, didn't really resonate exactly with, the taking side in journalism is something that, at least they try to explain to me that you cannot really do that. The reality is very different. It's much muddier indeed. But this muddier terrain, or let's say the terrain has become muddier also thanks to the possibilities of datafication and the new alliances that Colin mentioned. So I have some quotes here. A journalist in particular felt compelled to, this is the word that he used, to go into activism Another one to go into policy advocacy concerning, for example, data access and data transparency due to, and I quote again, the lack of data transparency and access that was hampering his job as a journalist. So this is someone who is a journalist, will be a journalist, but felt the need to also become an activist to support open access, for example, of state-produced information. But also someone else who said, well, actually, I became progressively an activist and even defined himself as data activism because I wanted to do things that matter. Now, so it is like an hybridity of repertoire that I find extremely interesting. So professionals that were separated before, in particular advocacy and journalism, invade each other's territory and do so consciously, not without friction. That's also very important to say. And the friction happens very often, for example, for journalists, at least the one that we interview at the level in the newsroom. What is legitimate practice and what is not legitimate practice? And you know, what have you been taught as a journalist in journalism school and what you end up practicing? Or the relation that you establish with other, for example, with activists. Second point, this is something that I'm going to be briefed about because Colin already stole my thunder. The new alliances, what he called the new data networks. I would call them new alliances, but that is exactly where we are going. So, and I have a quote from an activist that said, collecting data and evidence on a problem is campaigning. Actually, you know, journalists would say, well, it's actually journalism, right? But the quote continues, journalists can support that, so can support campaigning. They complement each other. If you can persuade a good journalist to look at your data, your as an activist data, it is like gold dust for activists. So there is this notion that, you know, these alliances are not only possible, but they're desirable, and they're actually fundamental to go about with, I'm Italian after all, with making change in their respective fields of action. Hackers was already mentioned as one of these interesting alliances. But I have to say, this is also a way for example, activists who are typically under-resourced, and sometimes more than journalists in certain countries in particular, to overcome novel divides. So what we see with datafication is that there is a sort of novel digital divide. You might remember the digital divides from the 90s. Now we assume that that's long gone, which is absolutely not true, sadly. But we don't talk about that anymore. But what we see is that specifically in the field of civil society, but I guess we can say the same for journalism in underserved and under-resourced regions, there is a massive divide between the haves and the have-nots, where the haves are those who actually have the skills, not only the sensibility, but especially the skills and the machinery, the literacy, to use data, to take advantage of the possibilities of data, and those instead who are excluded from that. And what you see in particular, the realm of the civil society, is that if in the past you could have done a campaign exclusively basing it on values, like poverty is, you know, is not just poverty, needs to be corrected because, you know, we don't like people suffering or something like that. Now you have to come up with evidence. You have to come up with statistics. Might be also very banal statistics, just descriptive statistics of whatever kind, but you have to have numbers. And this is a problem that civil society is increasingly aware of, especially, as I said, in regions where literacy, machines, and access to data are not as widespread as in this side of the world. So then alliances are a nice way to cut across these divides. But I think it's important to be aware of these divides as well. And then the final point I want to make is about the hybrid roles. So activists not only appropriate the repertoires of journalists, but they assume their identity as well. And this is, for me, was extremely surprising. And I refer in particular, and we have only evidence for the case of Latin America, but we are doing more research into this, in particular in collaboration with Mir and Gutierrez in Spain, that I mentioned earlier. So we look in particular at the case of Info Amazonia, which is a network that you know, mobilizes around the Amazon forest, which is the biggest tropical forest in the world, and also, as you all know, very endangered by deforestation, pollution, and you name it. So Info Amazonia is a network which is present in 8 countries. The largest portion of the Amazon is in Brazil, but as you know, it spreads across borders as well. And what this network does is to engage in the production of alternative news and analysis, but also data collection on forest fires, for example, which is one of the ways in which then people start, doing, let's say, other things which are not particularly legal with the forest territory, but also air quality and deforestation. And this initiative started with, realizing that the information, I mean, we all know that the Amazon forest is being depleted by the minute, but we don't actually know exactly what's the dimension of the phenomenon. So what they did, because they feel they cannot trust the institutions, and certainly even less the industry, which is the main responsible, together with the state, of this deforestation, Info Amazonia decided to go into the realm of crowdsourced data, interactive mapping, so they use tools they produce themselves, and they ask citizens to monitor the situation and report on that. It's something that Gustavo Faleiros, who is an academic and a journalist in Brazil, called Geo Journalism, so doing journalism at the service of combining, let's say, tools of the geographers with journalism. But what is interesting, why do I mention Info Amazonia here? Well, Info Amazonia is interesting because these are activists. There are some journalists as well, but they don't have press cards, for example, right? And probably they would not be recognized by the fellow journalists in their country as legitimate journalists. Yet, they define themselves journalists. And why do they do that? And when we ask them, but it seems to me they actually are pretty much like an activist. I mean, all your repertoires and your identity and all of that. For two reasons. One is the legitimacy. So they say, well, it's not very good to be an activist in Brazil today, and in many other neighboring countries. Journalism has a certain status. So what you see is that journalism is an entry point for activism, but it's also a sort of cover that legitimizes and gives a higher status to data that otherwise are just, considered simply activist-produced data. So journalism legitimizes activism, but also interestingly, journalism is a way of self-protection. So basically what they say is like, if you're an activist, you end up killed. They might end up killed anyway, sadly. But at least by self-proclaimed journalist, maybe someone believes that, and journalism, the freedom of the press is enshrined in the Declaration of Human Rights, which is not necessarily upheld anywhere in the region, but by defining themselves as journalists, they feel they can protect themselves a little bit more than if they were only activists. So I guess that's what I have to share with you today. I think all of this is extremely exciting, and there's much more work to do to understand how these two different roles can complement each other and make the world a better place.
Thanks, Stefania, and I will follow up to what Colin and Stefania just said, in particular when it comes to 2 points that they raised. And as Colin was saying, journalism has become the central way to make sense of datafication with all this process of reflectivity that he mentioned. And datafication has been a real paradigm change for society at large, as Stefania was saying. And if we look back to the past years, from 2010 on, most of these debates about the impact of datafication and the role of data in society came because of whistleblowing. I was mentioning before Snowden, and as the case that really put surveillance on top of the agenda of the media, on top of the agenda of politics, hopefully. And it really started because of a whistleblowing case. And the same can be said for Cambridge Analytica. Christopher Wiley used to be one of the masterminds of Cambridge Analytica, the company, and he decided to become a whistleblower in order to denounce the practices of the company and how data can be misused in politics and campaigning. But there are some other smaller, less global cases that really helped making sense and bring evidence about the role of data in certain fields of society. For instance, the drone papers published by The Intercept in 2015 really brought evidence of how data really got people killed with drone strikes in countries like Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, and so on. And more recently, we had some pattern of quasi-whistleblowing cases really at the border with hacking, where surveillance company has been exposed by hackers. The infamous Italian company hacking team was hacked, ironically, by some hackers really released the internal emails and brought evidence about how the company was selling surveillance software and spywares to non-democratic countries despite EU regulations and so on. So these are some of the instances that we could raise when it comes to the role of whistleblowing in helping making sense of data and anything data and its impact in society. So in a sense, whistleblowing is also probably a consequence of the black boxes metaphors that were already mentioned here by my colleagues. When there is no way to access, there is no way to have transparency about certain societal pattern works, we need whistleblowers to have evidence and understand what is really going on. And of course, before these cases, already WikiLeaks played a role in this. And looking at data journalism, we can say that the work that some of the major news organizations did together with Julian Assange back in 2010 was really one of the moments where data journalism really became mainstream in a sense. And of course, already the role of cybersecurity, the role of encryption was clear, was brought on the agenda starting in 2010, in my opinion, because of how WikiLeaks was using these tools. And again, the Panama Papers are also very interesting in bringing data into journalism. They were one of the most enormous cases when it comes to this kind of investigations, and it was all about data. 11 million documents and another massive data journalism investigations was really one of the cases where really this analysis of data became routinized within journalism. And again, if we look at Snowden, if we look at WikiLeaks, if we look at the role of hackers and whistleblowers, we can really say that there has been an hacking turn in journalism. And journalism is becoming probably more and more in connection with the hacking field and so on. And we can look at this phenomenon using Pierre Bourdieu field theory as a theoretical background, where we can see that journalistic field and the hacking field are really into a process of hybridization. Some of the levels where we can see this happens are with the tools or the repertoires, and the practices that have been created are the interplay between these two fields. And encryption is definitely something that wasn't in journalism until this hacking turn happened. And this is because hackers have the technological capital that journalism is lacking. They have the tools, they know how to use them, they know how to protect privacy on the internet, and so on. So these tools like Secure Drop or GlobalX or even Signal and Tor entered the journalistic field coming from the hacking field. And we can see how there are even some bridge organizations who are mediating between the journalistic field and the hacking field. I can mention the Freedom of the Press Foundation, who operates Secure Drop for whistleblowing platforms, or the Hermes Center for Transparency and Digital Human Rights, who operates the GlobalX software, which is very similar to Secure Drops, and hackers, or even the Tor project itself is kind of a bridge organization between these two worlds. And when it comes to practices, definitely whistleblowing, it's in this area. But I would like here to point your attention to what Gabriella Coleman calls the public interest acts, which is, and I'm quoting her, entails a computer infiltration for the purpose of leaking documents that will have political consequences. And the example that I've already mentioned about the surveillance industry being exposed, it's really this. You have hackers going into the server of an organization or a company to take out data and expose them with some point of contact with whistleblowing. Of course, none of these cases are genuine, not all of these cases are genuine, not all of these cases are ethical whistleblowing, but there are definitely some point of contact. Hacking Team was one of the major cases, but Motherboard in 2017 published a great investigation about Retina and FlexiSpy, which are two companies operating in the stalkerware market, which is a market where you can buy a spyware to kind of spy on your partner, to spy on someone you like or someone you dislike. So there is a market for these things. And the way we are making sense of this, and the way we are making sense of the problems and the troubles and the ethical concerns going on there is coming up thanks to hackers becoming sources of information. And I would like to close this by saying we are talking about data, but the human cost of these things are not to be forgotten. Unfortunately, for instance, Chelsea Manning is back in jail, as you probably know. She has been back in jail for a month now, and we know the news of today about Julian Assange being probably taken out from the embassy and given to the authorities. So although we're discussing data, we're discussing web and connected things, we should really also keep in mind that these things also happen with humans, and Snowden, again, is a good example of this. And we should not be blinded by some digital sublime when it comes to these discourses, and keep the attention also on the human factors. And Adrian, you're going to discuss assumption about hybridity that we should avoid, and especially when it comes to covering datafication.
Yeah, so I'll try to be quick so we'll have time for some discussion, but I wanted to, so it makes sense that I would be on this panel talking about these issues because I've been also looking at hackers and activists and journalists sort of together in the journalism field in particular. I think myself, along with my colleagues here, tend to think about hybridity as a positive thing and looking at ways that journalism can be enhanced, and some of the old weaknesses of journalism can be overcome when they collaborate and sort of garner the resources of other fields and skills. But there's two assumptions that I think that we really should avoid, and these are assumptions that are becoming clearer and clearer as time goes on. So maybe 5 years ago, the hybridity seemed solidly a positive thing, and today I think we really need to take a look at like the downsides of it. So one assumption is that people who shape and tap into this new hybrid environment are working in the service of justice or democracy or progressive action, because that's not always and not even mostly the case, as I think we can see more and more with the rise of so-called activist media on the extreme right. And the way that leaks are being weaponized. So if you think of the WikiLeaks release of the Clinton emails exactly on the same day that the controversial Access Hollywood tape of Trump was released. But also, in the more routinized way, that leaks are supporting a broken political system. And I'm actually not sure how much this goes beyond the United States context, but I'm pretty sure it will if it doesn't already. So basically, as I'm sure most of you know, the Trump administration is full of prolific leakers. The only way we know anything about what's going on in the White House right now is through leaks. And Jonathan Swan, an Axios journalist who's a longtime political reporter, wrote a really interesting piece on how White House leaks are both strategic to drive the narrative within political negotiations within the administration, and also tactical to settle scores among politicians. And I'm just going to read you this quote that he got from an anonymous leaker source of his. It said, "You have to realize that working here is kind of like being in a never-ending Mexican standoff. Everyone has guns," meaning leaks, "pointed at each other, and it's only a matter of time before someone shoots. There's rarely a peaceful conclusion, so you might as well shoot first." So journalists are embracing datafication and leak culture, and in doing so, they've created these tools and infrastructures to support the flow of anonymous leaks, thinking that it's on behalf of public interest. But I think that we really need to start thinking about what obligations journalists have when they know they're being tools in a political system that's broken. And how does the ability to leak change the way politics plays out? So what if people within the Trump administration had to be upfront about their opposition? How would that change the way politics is unfolding? So that's one of the assumptions I think we should avoid. The second assumption is that hybridity is evenly distributed, because it's not. So scandal stories like the Snowden revelation and Cambridge Analytica tend to rely really heavily on official sources, or what Lance Bennett has called authority order bias, whereby journalists tend to use as sources authority figures who provide assurances that everything's going to be okay. So so I did a study, which I won't go too far into, on the coverage of the Snowden revelation, and we had a comparative analysis of 6 different countries. And Silvio Weisbord and I did the United States, and we found that the discussion in journalism rarely went beyond the spectrum of security versus privacy. This was the spectrum of the debate. And this was just echoing the debates within the political elite of the United States. And actually, we saw this happening. Domestic political elite sources were dictating the coverage in all 6 countries that we studied. So that's just a way that you can see that when things are deemed a scandal or a crisis, journalists tend to rely on authoritative sources that sort of confirm the status quo. So basically, this narrowing of the debate at times when we really need to be hearing from, not tech industry, but tech reporters who really understand the nuances of datafication and of the issues around not just privacy, but data justice and algorithmic inequalities that emerge are really important, but it doesn't always get integrated into the coverage, especially around these big issues. So when the points of view of the political elite, who frankly don't know much about the impact of datafication, get amplified, we don't end up getting a very nuanced story. So there's tons of examples of hybridity that's been working really well. Within journalism, one example is ProPublica's Documenting Hate, which is a large-scale effort that seeks to collect and verify reports of hate crimes and bias incidents around the country, and they work with NGOs and civil rights organizations and academics to sort of coalesce this information in one place. But there doesn't seem to be that level of robustness and collaboration around data yet, or datafication, but I'm just gonna end there. And maybe, are we gonna open it up to questions?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Thank you, Adrian. And we have time for a few questions, so if any of you in the audience has one, just raise your hand. We would like to kick off this with you. Yes, there is a microphone coming.
Hello. Maybe I'm a bit off topic, but I was wondering if these media products based on data are really popular. I mean, more popular than stories not involving numbers or percentage. And because sometimes I have the impression that they are more popular among journalists than readers. And so have you ever studied their popularity in some way? Thank you.
I remember there was some research about the reach of data journalists.
Not exactly about the reach of data journalism, but I think it's a good observation that you have. So if you as a research, you study a specific genre of journalism, such as data journalism, you tend to have a slightly more, let's say, above average perspective of the topic. But having not done a research on the reach actually of data journalism is a bit difficult to say. So what I can say, nevertheless, is that types such as data journalism, they, at least in the UK, they have an increasing success. Not quite sure whether it is exactly the same thing in other countries. Maybe you can add something.
Yeah, maybe I'm not the best qualified to answer this because I teach data journalism. So, of course, I think that this stuff is very popular. But, so I know that, for example, Alberto Cairo has been doing some work on data visualizations in particular. So not data journalism necessarily as a project, as full project, but the visualization part of it, and the interactive visualization as well. And there's quite some evidence that, for example, also the way we learn and process the information is facilitated by the visual support. So there is also some, behavioral data on that. But I wouldn't be able, off the top of my head, to quote anything.
Yeah, I think just to add on this, what you can actually see, and this is where some empirical evidence is actually existing, is if you look into the newsrooms, they're investing heavily on whatever has to do with data, with automation, and with this kind of new journalistic genres.
And I think also if you look at the impacts of these stories, some of them were really massive. Like the Panama Papers, there was recently the 3rd anniversary of the starting of the investigation. They were able to kind of get back to $11 billion, if I recall correct the figures, of unpaid taxes. So there was a huge impact in that sense, and some policy changes following Snowden and so on. And the Cambridge Analytica case brought Mark Zuckerberg testifying at the Congress and the European Parliament, which is an achievement, I would say.
If I can just complement with the usual activist perspective. So, for example, there is NGOs increasingly reflect on what's the best format to offer the information to the public. And there's evidence, there's a great institution in the UK called the Open Development Institute, and they moved increasingly from producing exclusively written reports, you know, like you do a research, whatever, like 70 pages report, hey, there you go, maybe there's some minimal news coverage, to, for example, creating interactive visualization of their data. And what they realized, in particular with a story about missing fish, so illegal transport of fish in West Africa, they came up with a very interesting, almost like a game. It looked like a game, and that produced a lot of impact at the level of the United Nations and the level of legislation in one of the affected countries. Mm-hmm. Whether it is really because of the interactive visualization, not 100% sure, but that's what they like to believe, and that's why they do more of these things.
Hi, thank you for the interesting panel. So I'm just wondering, when we are talking about data journalism, so when we actually go to media organizations and we look into these teams, and we see primarily software engineers, we see designers, but we actually hardly find journalists in these teams. So what actually does it mean? Do we need different kind of trainings for these people? Because, I mean, software engineers have got a completely different background. Shouldn't they be trained as journalists? So is there kind of a gap when these kind of different skills come together? Do we have something in place? Or how could it change? I mean, it's a different kind of setting and different workflows.
If I may start on that, a couple of years ago, together with Philip and other colleagues from academia, we actually carried out a study on the educational background or the education of data journalists in Europe. So we did a comparative study on that, and this was, I think, some 4 years ago with data from 2015, yes, 4 years ago, so the data are from 2014. What we could see back then is that actually the educational path into data journalism were very unstructured. So a lot of people had to rely on their own sources, on their own resources, on their own initiatives. So, for instance, when it comes to the situation in Italy, many of these Italian data journalists had to either go abroad or to organize themselves and get hold of, I don't know, books or initiatives or online educational offers with regard to data journalism. So you're absolutely right that, at least back at the time, data journalists were not specifically trained as journalists, for instance. They were mainly people that had a strong interest into handling data, looking into statistics, looking into public administration, and then they slowly became, so to say, they slowly slipped into a more journalistic career then. In other countries, it was slightly more structured. So back then, for instance, in the UK, at the higher education level or the university, you had some first programs with regard to data journalism. Nowadays, I'm teaching in the United Kingdom, in London, and for instance, we at the University of London, we have a specific like you have in Amsterdam, a course on data journalism. So you train journalism students in data journalism. It has become, in the meantime, far more structured. Okay, so I think that if you will look nowadays into the newsrooms and see how are these teams composed, you might run into more journalists that have a educational background in journalism, and they haven't been socialized maybe in other countries. But still, you will see, you know, sort of these mixed groups with different educational backgrounds.
If I can add to that, at the same time, this move towards having more methodology that comes from computational social sciences into journalism, it's not that new, it's not that recent. But the field has been very slow at picking it up. So there's a book that I use when I teach data journalism, which is called Precision Journalism, and dates back to the 70s. Then there was a new edition in 2005, I remember correctly, it's Philip Mayer, a British journalist. And the idea then was like, we need more precision in the way we gather our evidence. Interviews are not sufficient. We need to also, you know, train ourselves into methodology. But then again, yeah, this was not, I mean, like big data changed a little bit in terms of the debate, making it much more urgent and especially much more approachable, because as you mentioned, like journalism would not traditionally be trained in this. So it's interesting to see how it has evolved.
Can I just want to add to that, there's been quite a bit of like research on sort of the culture of newsrooms when data journalists and developers and reporters have to work together. And one of the things that has broken down the sort of competition among and between journalists is the entrance of developers into the work zone, because development is much more about collaboration than reporting has ever been, because reporters were traditionally in competition with one another. So I think there's like kind of interesting ways that the cultures have complemented one another as well.
I think we have time for the last question. Yeah.
Okay, I'd like to say thank you for this panel. It's really interesting, thought-provoking, and there's so many points I could make. Partly because Philip has sort of systematically gone through all of my usual concerns about hackers and whistleblowers and the human cost of all this. I'm going to have to think about something different to ask. So coming back to this idea of activists and journalists, these identities getting closer together, all very interesting. I wonder when you're talking about the Syrian archive or something, I think something is missing here, because from my point of view, the sort of skill set of archiving, an archivist, and a focus, a concern for the preservation of leaked material and making sure it's accessible to the public at large, not just the people in the newsroom who are reporting on it. This seems to me to be quite an important dynamic and a very contested dynamic of what's going on at the moment. Witness, for example, the controversy over The Intercept recently announcing that they were going to close the archive of the Snowden documents, and actually to what extent the Snowden documents should be publicly available has been a very live debate. And, you know, there are archives of the Snowden documents that have been produced by third parties, of which I was one at one point. So, yeah, I'd really be interested in your comments on that.
Can you repeat the question?
So the question is whether you agree that archiving as a skill, as a skill and a repertoire, as well as activism, journalists should be in here. Because I don't think this is captured by journalism, actually. I don't think journalists often care very much about publicly accessible archives.
Yeah.
Well, it's a very interesting question. Archiving is what human rights organizations have been doing for ages, right? Because if you want to document and support your case, then you have to archive. So I do agree with you. It's definitely much more in the court and the skill sets and the identity of activists as opposed to the identity of journalists. So if the question is, how do we make sense of the Syrian archive? I mean, I study the Syrian archive as an example of activism, certainly not as an example of journalism, but I do recognize some of the tension, at least towards finding things in a complex reality, which then is typical, of journalists, right? They're getting into the nose for it.
Yeah, I think we have to close now. So many thanks to anyone for joining the panel, the technicians and the volunteers. I'm very happy to have done this with some of my favorite people in the academia. And I would like to close it by quoting what Julian Nguyen said yesterday, presenting the markup, and saying that their method will be journalists plus the scientific method. So we're going to see some hybridization between journalists and the academia. Who knows? So many thanks again, and enjoy the festival. Cheers.